She convinced powerful people to invest nearly $1 billion in her fake startup. But in the end, she got caught. But how did a young student manage to fool millionaires and politicians? How did her PR campaign almost trigger an outbreak of a dangerous disease? And most importantly, what psychological tricks helped her turn $160,000 into a $9 billion empire? An unbelievable story coming up in today's episode. It all started in 2003. Elizabeth was a sophomore at Stanford when she suddenly decided to drop out. Instead of finishing school, she took all the money her parents had saved for her education and used it as startup capital. That was around $160,000, and no one could have imagined that in just a few years, these $160,000 would turn into a $9 billion tech empire. She came up with the idea for her startup while still in Stanford. Elizabeth wanted to revolutionize medical diagnostics. No more painful blood draws from veins, just a tiny finger prick, and boom, you get a full analysis of your body. She promised that a single drop of blood could provide nearly 200 different tests. But the best part? These tests would be done using a small, portable device and cost 10 times less than regular lab tests. The idea was so tempting that the startup attracted over 270 investors, including media mogul Rupert Murdoch, billionaire Carlos Slim, Oracle co-founder Larry Ellison. The list goes on. Even politicians and top executives were in awe of her and poured money into her technology. One of the biggest believers was the supermarket chain Safeway. They were so convinced by her invention that they spent $350 million to set up special testing labs in their stores, hoping to make billions off her revolutionary idea. But there was just one problem.
Can you tell us a secret?
The night and did nothing but work. Do you own a TV? No. Why not? I work all the time. Elizabeth's mother once shared that her daughter worked for 5 straight days without stopping to eat or sleep. Sure, hit like if you wouldn't mind having such incredible productivity. But the truth came out during the court hearings in the Theranos case. It turned out that Elizabeth wasn't the ascetic she claimed to be. She spent the company's money on private jets, luxury cars, and hotel rooms that cost $155,000 per night. Do you think there was a TV in that $15,000 room? We think so. However, this information came to light later. At the beginning of her career, Elizabeth presented herself as an ascetic who needed nothing but work, and the investors believed her. It's much easier to trust your money to someone who's passionate about their idea than to someone looking for ways to live luxuriously. Elizabeth's persuasion skills were incredibly strong. Even after her fraud was exposed, there were still people who believed in her sincerity. One of them was lawyer Jeff Cooperman. I think eventually the company would have been a great success if it had been allowed to run. The jury also decided that Elizabeth Holmes truly believed in her technology. Yes, she attracted investments in a fraudulent way, but not because she wanted to get rich, rather because she genuinely wanted to change the world for the better. Here's how juror Wayne Katz commented on this. It's tough to convict somebody, especially somebody so likable with such a positive dream. Of course, a positive dream is great. A wealthy man might spend $1 million or $2 on the dream of a girl he likes, but not hundreds of millions. Such crazy amounts are only spent when you hope to get billions in return. That's exactly what Elizabeth Holmes promised to her investors. She said that soon her technology would be needed by absolutely everyone on Earth. And we'd like to see a world in which every person gets access to this type of basic testing. Modern tests are expensive. Most of them require a doctor's referral. And getting blood drawn from a vein is just terrible. Elizabeth claimed that up to 60% of people refuse to get tested to avoid such torture. But if testing could be painless and cheap, millions of people would immediately open their wallets. While other labs would bring in just a little money for their shareholders, Theranos would bring its investors $200 billion. Tempting, right? To make the picture even more appealing, Elizabeth bet on media-worthy diseases. In 2014, the Ebola outbreak began in West Africa. Elizabeth immediately claimed that Theranos could detect Ebola and save millions of lives. For Theranos lab director Adam Rosendorf, that was the last straw. Working with Ebola requires the highest level of safety, but in Theranos labs, instead of clean zones, airlocks, and protective suits, there were just masks. Adam feared that such a publicity stunt could lead to an outbreak of the deadly disease in the U.S. and then across the world. But Elizabeth Holmes didn't seem to care. When she ignored Adam's concerns, he quit and later testified against her in court. Eventually, Elizabeth backed off from the Ebola virus PR, but that was just one test out of the 200 quick and cheap analyses that her miracle device supposedly performed. To the average person, it sounded like a dream, but to a medical professional, it seemed like pure madness. Back in Stanford, her mentors had warned Elizabeth that you couldn't extract so much information from just one drop of blood. Elizabeth drew her conclusions and made sure that the list of investors and board members had as few medical professionals as possible. After all, it's much easier to sell your idea to politicians, military officials, and media moguls who don't fully understand what they're investing in. Now here comes the most intriguing part of the investigation. To sell her idea to politicians and military officials, Elizabeth first had to meet them somewhere. But where? Usually, the secret to Elizabeth's success is said to be Stanford's engineering dean, Channing Robertson. Allegedly, it was he who introduced her to the first investors. But in reality, Elizabeth started building her network much, much earlier. Her father, Christian Rasmus Holmes IV, was the vice president of the large energy company Enron, and her mother, Ann L. Holmes, worked for a congressional committee. It seems that even before Elizabeth was born, she had already built useful connections within the U.S. government. Additionally, her grandfather was a high-ranking official in the Pentagon in the early 1970s, and from a young age, Elizabeth was friends with the daughters of Tim Draper. Draper was a billionaire and a leader in global venture capital. He was one of the first to support Elizabeth's project, and he became a massive green flag for other influential people. If Tim Draper himself was on board, the project was definitely trustworthy. In this way, the billionaire inadvertently helped the frauds to deceive some of the most influential people of the time. But could millionaires really follow Draper so blindly? It's surprising, but yes, they could. Back in 1961, scientists proved that people instinctively trust those who hold authority. And the greater the authority of a person, the more blindly others believe their statements, even if those statements are completely insane. By the way, Elizabeth Holmes didn't only rely on Draper's authority during negotiations. She could present fake documents with the Pfizer logo or formal letters from the Johns Hopkins Medical School. Investors saw the prestigious logo and assumed that serious scientists had approved Theranos' technology, so they thought they could trust her. Of course, that wasn't true. Neither Pfizer nor Johns Hopkins had studied or let alone approved Theranos' technology.
How much people trusted her, eventually they started asking for proof. Where are the scientific publications? Where are the prototypes? Where's all that money going? And that's when Elizabeth's idol came to her rescue. Of course, it was Steve Jobs. He was a phenomenal entrepreneur. In fact, Elizabeth took quite a lot from Apple's founder. She dropped out of school like Steve Jobs, she wore black turtlenecks just like him, and when notes from Elizabeth Holmes made it to CNBC, there were 3 magical words: become Steve Jobs. But why? The answer is simple. Elizabeth was using the halo effect. This famous cognitive bias means that if something gives us a good impression at first glance, we'll trust it more. By associating herself with Steve Jobs' empire, Elizabeth automatically earned points in the eyes of others. She also copied a solution from Steve to deal with her own problem. When Steve Jobs introduced the first-generation iPhone on January 9, 2007, it was just a non-working prototype. The software didn't function properly, the phone froze, and it lost signal. But with a little cleverness and some magic of editing, voila, the presentation showed not a glitchy prototype, but a wonderful, revolutionary device. Elizabeth Holmes decided she could do the same. This trick is called fake it until you make it. When she was pressed for concrete results, she presented investors with a portable blood testing device. It was called Edison, just like Steve Jobs' prototype. This one didn't work either. Out of the promised 200 tests, Edison could only perform 12, and even those results were wrong. To make the numbers seem somewhat accurate, Theranos employees had to dilute the tiny blood samples they collected, run them on other equipment, and tamper with the results. Still, the illusion of a working prototype was created, and somehow that was enough for the investors. So a former Stanford student became a magnet for investments. At some point, she should have stopped, but she couldn't. Instead, she continued to falsify data and went too far. Theranos employees knew very well that they were doing awful things. I think at the end of the day, everyone was concerned that we weren't giving patients the right results. By hiding the truth, Elizabeth Holmes and her partner Ramesh Balwani used several tactics to suppress employees and prevent leaks of information about the problems at Theranos. They cultivated a culture of fear and surveillance within the company. The company installed surveillance cameras, controlled access to rooms, and monitored emails and phone calls. Some employees suspected they were even being followed by private investigators. Balwani used a harsh authoritarian style, belittled employees, threatened them with firing, and forced them to work in a high-stress environment. Each department was given limited information so that people wouldn't see the full picture of the technology's failure. For example, engineers didn't know that the tests were still being run on third-party lab equipment. Every employee signed strict confidentiality agreements, threatening lawsuits if they revealed any information. Theranos lawyers actively intimidated former employees who tried to tell the truth. One former worker, Tyler Schultz, the grandson of George Shultz, the former U.S. Secretary of State, said that private investigators followed him and company lawyers came to his home to silence him. Elizabeth Holmes inspired her employees with the idea of saving lives, telling them that Theranos was developing technology that would change the world. This gave them some sense of duty and caused them to ignore the warning signs. Holmes had a powerful ability to persuade, even charming experienced investors and employees. Many believed in her vision and thought the temporary problems could be overcome. Those who doubted or asked too many questions were fired immediately. The average tenure at Theranos was less than 2 years, and high-level specialists left the company after a few months due to the toxic atmosphere. When partners or investors came to see how the Theranos devices were working, employees would use regular laboratory analyzers for blood samples instead of the company's own technology. Employees working with the tests were forced to modify or falsify data to make the results seem credible.
Unable to handle the pressure, the company's leading biochemist tragically took his own life in October 2015. Journalist John Carreyrou from the Wall Street Journal published an investigation based on interviews with former employees and analysis of the company's internal documents, revealing serious discrepancies between Theranos' claimed capabilities and the actual effectiveness of their technology. This investigation caught the attention of regulators and the public, which eventually led to the exposure of the fraud. After the article's publication, Theranos tried to deny the allegations, but further investigations confirmed Carreyrou's conclusions, and Elizabeth Holmes's success story came to an end. Well, now the villain is behind bars, but it still remains unclear why she did all this in the first place. There are various opinions on this. Some are convinced that Elizabeth genuinely wanted to help humanity, but this lady didn't listen to real scientists and set up labs with numerous violations. Does someone who dreams of a scientific breakthrough behave like that? Personally, we think Elizabeth's dreams were much more simplistic. She wanted money and the fame of a trailblazer. What do you think about her? Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next story.